All right, we're going to continue. We're going to dive deep now. Not that we weren't diving deeply before. Now we're going to get into the ethics, the ethical implications of persuasion. Or who decides? How do they decide? So I'm going to invite two folks to join us to talk about our agency, how we align our tools with our values and our ethics and our moral compass. And the first person who's going to do that for us is Mr. Michael Rozenberg from Ustwo. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So here we go. So welcome back to the second session. I'll be talking a little bit about current AI's abilities. And it's better? Yeah. And some of the sort of how we can make it slightly more ethical. This is what we will cover. Current AI, what it can do, what we can do with it, and how can we make it safe, and a little bit about the future. So current AI, what can it do? Well, first of all, it's all about patterns. So the sort of AI that is popular and being talked about right now, it's basically superhuman pattern machines. We train them on loads amounts of data, and then we can use them to either find patterns in data, so we can use them to find financial fraud or help us with genome sequencing, or we can help them, or we can have them to replay patterns, which is like ChatGPT or Midjourney. So in all essence, what they do is you train them on a lot of data, and then they replay patterns that could be text or an image. And in essence, all they do is they try to take one word and place it after the next, and it uses probability to sort of, and some other smart tricks to decide. You wanna better? To use some tricks to decide which word to put there. And Midjourney does the same with pixels. But for all purpose, it's a dumb tool. It doesn't really have any intelligence in it. It doesn't understand what it does, and it doesn't have the concept of sort of higher thought. So it can't generalize. It can replay a text, but it doesn't understand the concept of mathematics or the concepts of chess or the concept of love. So even though it can imitate human behavior, and when it does it well, it's almost like a human-machine mimicry, it doesn't really understand what it does. And so that's why you see all these hilarious examples of when you ask it to multiply two numbers, it fails. Or when you ask it to play chess, it does an illegal move. Now, there's another type of AI that is being talked about called artificial general intelligence. And that's AI that actually can think, that can reason, that can sort of generalize into more complex concepts. But that kind of AI doesn't exist yet. And so most of the tools we see today, they just sort of repeat these patterns. Now, the problem is that we today have systems out there that we don't really understand how they come up with their answer. So we train them on a lot of data, they produce a result, and we don't understand how we got to that result. And therefore, we can't really control what they will put out. There are other types of AI where we can trace back. I think Katarina talked about that as explainable AI. But sort of the major things you read about today and ChatGPT and those kind of general large language models are not this kind of type of AI. So they produce results, and we don't know what they will produce. Which means that we have put the system out there that we don't control, and we don't know what the effect is going to be. And similar to social media, which we, to this day, still haven't really figured out how to handle, we don't know how to handle these systems, which is a major threat, I think, to our society. And it all boils down to that these kind of AI, they don't understand intent. They they can sort of replay the pattern that they've learned, but they don't understand why. And so it's really hard for us to guarantee that they will actually do what we want them to do. But even though we have this situation, we can make use of them, and they can produce results if we are conscious about how we set them up. So let's look at some examples for what we can do, we can build, and how can we then constrain them. And if we look at the second part of that question, like making it safer, we'll look at how can we train them, how can we align them, which is make sure that the output is what we want them to produce, and how can we sort of influence and control them. So the first thing is training. If you want more predictable results, you can make it more narrow. You can restrict what it knows about, and you can make sure that your source data is cleaned. So if you take ChatGPT, for example, it's been trained on all text on the internet, more or less, and that data contains facts and false stuff. But if we then narrow it down instead, we can actually make sure that the results it produces are more in tune with what we want. So here are some examples. For example, Emily, which is a conversational chatbot that a company here in Malmö, Nordics, actually developed together with Helsingborg. And the problem we're trying to solve here is that as an immigrant, for example, or as a native, going to your first job interview could be quite a challenge, and it could be something intimidating. It could also be that maybe Swedish is not your native tongue, and so you have to be interviewed in a language that you might not command fully yet. And what Helsingborg wanted to do was to provide interview training for people. But of course, people is a limited resource, so we can only do so much of it. But here AI can actually help. So they've developed this conversational chatbot. It's trained on interview settings. It allows you to do this 24/7. And so suddenly we can actually provide a service where people can train on interview settings. They can train the language, they can train the kind of questions that will occur, and they can then in the real interview actually project a more true image of themselves. And the way it was constrained was that it was trained on, the kind of conversations, the kind of data, the kind of questions that might pop up in this setting. So had they used ChatGPT, no one really knows where that conversation might have led, or what kind of questions might have popped up. But because we made it more narrow, we can get more predictable results. And another example is from India, where there's a problem with some subjects being quite taboo to talk about. So sexual health, women's rights, having a period, masturbation, sort of these things are not very much talked about in the culture. And finding someone to talk to about this could be quite tricky. And again, here AI can play a vital role, because AI is not a person; it's a system. You can talk to it without the fear of how that the other part will share that data with someone if you trust the system. And again, to make sure that it was safe, it was trained on quite a narrow set of data. The data that they based it on was from a TV show that actually talked about these kind of issues. And then they put this bot on Facebook, so that a lot of young people can now interact with this and learn about a subject that they otherwise have trouble finding information about, or find someone to talk to about this. So we can constrain the data, make sure that it doesn't know about all the stuff we don't want it to know about. What about how do we then make sure that it actually produces the results we want? Well, that takes us to alignment. And alignment is actually one of the sort of biggest issues and challenges with the large language models that we have today. And it's all about making sure that the output is what we want. So if you want it to produce the results that you expect, you can give the AI feedback to reinforce or suppress the sort of outcomes that you want. And an example of this is from November last year, where in gaming we have a huge problem with harassment. About 80% of women that play online games, multiplayer games, report having experienced harassment or toxicity. All minority groups report the same thing. And so for a long time you've been able to chat in games via text, and that we can moderate quite easily. At least we can monitor it quite easily. But with AI, we can actually also monitor the voice chats, and that's what happened in November. So Blizzard, among some other big players, introduced this sort of moderation tool into their voice chat systems, where they now actually listen in on all conversations. But because games have different kinds of language, they use different abbreviations, and each game have their own terms that they use, and every subgroup within the big gaming community might have different language. It's really hard to train that on an existing data set. And instead, they have to rely on alignment. So it's up to the user to actually flag when something has been said that they feel has been derogatory or an attack. And then the AI can take a snippet of that, translate that into text, and save that as a record that the moderation system can then act upon. And then finally, we've trained it on the correct data, we've aligned the system, but you also have to think about what data do you pull in, how do you use that data, and what data do you retain? So especially in something like health, the data we use, the data we work on can be extremely sensitive. And so we need to find a way to be able to conduct this kinds of research or provide services, but still think about the integrity of the people's data that we use. And one way of doing this is called federation, where we take these AI models, but we run them on your own device. And that could be a smartwatch, it could be a phone, and we only analyze your data on device. We never share that data with the big system. So we can share the insights that we learn. We can update the central model so it becomes better, but we don't need your personal data. And that's a way to be able to improve the ability of the system without actually risking my integrity. An example of what not to do, though, with AI is to fake stuff. And this is an example that came out recently. It's a company that promised that you can synthesize users, and instead of doing research on real users, we can just use AI. But in this case, this AI will not be able to actually represent the real people because there aren't any real people. And so this is a really bad example of how to not use AI. So what about the future? First of all, I said there's no real intelligent AI. Last month, GPT-4 was launched. It's a giant step in capability, and we now have actual researchers having a debate whether or not this shows the first signs of intelligence. So when I said that social media and the problem with social media, now we have a system that maybe can think or something similar, and we don't know how it works, and it's out there in the public. So the bleak outlook, if I look into the future, is that AI will allow the filter bubbles and polarization to increase even more. 5 years from now, we won't run the same apps on our phones. AI will build my apps for me. You will have your own apps built by AI for you. So we'll have totally different apps. We'll look at the different movies because I will ask AI to create my movies for me. You will do the same, so we don't share that. And if we watch a TV show, I want Harrison Ford to be the hero, but you want Taylor Swift, and you just ask the AI and it will switch it out. So now we don't have the same common ground. We don't share the same upbringing or cultural references. And we don't know what we can trust. And so that will sort of lead to the breakdown of culture and our society. But then if you have a more positive outlook on things, AI can help with accessibility, make things more accessible, for visually impaired or hearing impaired, it can be more objective. So I could ask it before the next election, can you please summarize what the left party stands for? And instead of looking at their website, it can analyze all the things that they have voted on over the last 10 years, all the interviews that they've made, all the articles they have written, and it gives me a more nuanced picture because it doesn't have any kind of interest in it. Or it can help us with a new era of enlightenment where it can actually help us research the sort of cure for cancer or is there life on Mars or whatever. And we've seen it being used in a very creative way already. So where do we go from here? Well, I think as sort of designers, technologists, creators, what we really need to think about is the systems we create and what outcomes do we want them to produce. It's not enough to just be able to do something. We need to think about the consequences and where it will lead to. And we need to do that before we remove the off switch. Because if we just put it out there and it starts wreaking havoc, I think it would be too late. Thank you.